With the release of Fire Emblem Engage comes a huge wave of challenge videos, and I initially thought there wasn't much to do for a challenge since everybody's already done ringless and that just makes the game normal. But upon further inspection, I decided on a challenge that is worthy of the Ansel G seal of approval with the question, can you beat Fire Emblem Engage while only using Engage mode? Now, what exactly does this challenge entail, and what do I have set as the rules? Engage mode is a new ability introduced in the Fire Emblem series, and it allows us to gain power from characters known as emblems. This ability unfortunately only lasts for 3 turns before it goes away, and we'll have to refill our engage meter to bring it back by either waiting on a blue engage tile or tank 7 hits from enemies. Now for the rules. We're not allowing DLC emblems because it kind of trivializes part of the game, and while we're disengaged with an emblem, we will not be able to do any meaningful actions. A meaningful action is counted by when the EXP bar goes up, so that means no attacking and no using stabs. The only way we can gain XP outside of this is by chain guarding, missing attacks, and using the arena since it gives us XP without us really doing anything. This will result in a very high amount of underleveled units, unfortunately. And as for the difficulty chosen, I was going to originally do this challenge on hard mode because I'm not the greatest at this game, but I know that's something people are probably not going to like, so I'm going in on Maddening, which is the hardest difficulty of the game, with probably the most strict rule set. Starting off with the prologue, we are set in an empty room with this mystery man standing before our main character, Alir. He will attack us, and unfortunately we will have to attack back since we don't have access to our items menu yet. So, did we already lose the challenge? No, we did not. This is the only chapter in the game where you cannot gain XP or SP, so since the XP meter didn't show up at all, we get a free pass for this first chapter. Chapter 1, Awake at Last. The second chapter in this challenge presents us with a new character to play as, Vander. This does give us a new problem unfortunately since we don't have access to our items menu still, so that's another risk waiting for us. Another problem that shows itself to us is no matter where we are in this chapter, one of the corrupted enemies will find us and attack us in turn 1. So to combat this, we'll have to lure this corrupted enemy into the thicket. And thankfully, since none of the other enemies will attack Vander, we can finally open up the item menu and unequip our weapons. After a few turns, we can finally unlock the Engage skill for good and truly start this challenge. My strategy for this was to use Lodestar Rush on one enemy and then hide out in the bushes so we can continuously gain another Lodestar Rush so we can keep gaining bond levels with Marth. Trust me, it's going to be worth it in the next chapter. 39 turns. Chapter 2, Queen Lumera. After defeating the corrupted, we will meet with a new character, Lumera, which is the boss of this chapter. She isn't an enemy, but she will be one of the most formidable foes in this challenge, since we only have access to one usable character, and she has access to Emblem Sigurd, which gives her the ability to engage and become extremely strong just like Alir. Part 1 of this chapter was pretty simple. My strategy was to trade all the vulnerary to Alir so she can prepare for the next chapter. The rest of this section had us use turn 1 to fill our engage meter, turn 2 to defeat some enemies, and turn 3 to defeat Lumera. After defeating Lumera and co, we move on to the second and more challenging section of this chapter, where Lumera actually brings out Sigurd. And let me say this right now, this part of the chapter is one of the most difficult areas in the game. This part is exclusively made up of RNG, since at any moment Lumera could almost one-shot us with the Rider's Bane, which is not only very powerful, but it can also prevent Alir from attacking for 1 round because of the break mechanic. And to add on to this problem, the Rider's Bane has 70 hit rate and the Liberation has 90 hit rate. So we're pretty much required to have Lumera engaged while in this battle, because if she isn't, we'll have to bring this 26% hit rate up to a 50% hit rate. So although the Liberation would be better for us health-wise, it's a much better decision to go with the better luck. After around 70 tries, I finally managed to defeat Lumera in 8 turns. Chapter 3, Hostilities. After that treacherous battle with Lumera, Alir takes a little nap to let her demons come out for a short while before she goes back onto the battlefield. Now, I know I said the last chapter was fully luck-based, but this chapter, oh man, it's terrible. At any moment, a Lance user is able to break us. And we also don't have good odds in terms of avoid rate since chain attacking is introduced to this chapter. Chain attacking is not good for us. It pretty much gives the enemy a free hit to lower a unit's health slightly, but since we're at the start of the game, 4 damage is pretty much a fifth of our health. Thankfully on turn 2, we get introduced to Alfred, Etier, and Boucheron, which are not only incredible meat shields for this chapter, but they also provide us with 9 vulnerary altogether. So we can tank some hits, but obviously not too many. We also need to be careful while trading with units because every time you trade with someone, they will equip a weapon for whatever reason. As you can see on screen, I died a lot. This doesn't even show half the times I failed this chapter, but overall it was just straight RNG. Ultimately, my strategy was to damage a sword enemy and hope the lance units won't hit me so I could use Lodestar Rush on one and move on to this engaged tile once I ran out of engaged juice. After that, I would go on to the remaining enemies at the top and leave a Bime for last since she had some vulnerary she was clearly not afraid to use. We weren't able to do much damage to her at this point unfortunately, but something odd I did find out was that if we don't attack a Bime while she's under 50% health, she'll just refuse to use the vulnerary. I decided to let her attack me instead and Lodestar Rush to just barely scrape by with 29 turns. With this chapter completed, we also get access to the Somniel, which will be essential in completing this challenge. The only things we really care about here are the meals, workouts, well items, shops, and the arena. I'm not going to go into detail about these, but I pretty much used each of these between every chapter we played. Chapter 4, A Land in Bloom. After that lucky mess, Lumera hits the hay for the rest of the game and gives us the Ring of the Holy Knight before we go to the Kingdom of Firene. This chapter was feeling really nice today though, so even after giving us one ring, we get a second ring titled the Ring of the Caring Princess, Celica. Now this chapter should potentially be decently difficult for us, but of course in Ansel G fashion, I guess I'll show off a cool trick I wasn't able to make use of specifically because I was hungry for XP. Anyways, since the boss for this chapter, Rodine, is an armored unit, Clan would be very helpful if we gave him Sigurd and moved him around in a certain way that allowed him to slingshot across the entire map and straight to the boss. Now, I said this would be helpful, but since Clan isn't going to be used at all after this chapter, it's best if we keep him out of it. My strategy for this chapter was very simple. I would attack enemies on the left side of the map with Vander, and later with Saline until we reach these 2 engaged tiles. For now, my whole plan of action was to have one person engaged at a time, but when they were about to become disengaged, I would rotate another unit in and engage them, essentially rotating our units out to effectively dispose of each foe with little risk. Speaking of little risk, this chapter introduces us to the Draconic Time Crystal. This crystal is one of the most important items in this playthrough, mostly because I make mistakes a lot, and I need to re-strategize way too many times. One of these times was healing Saline so she could take out 2 foes without risking death, and another was because I forgot to equip Seraphim to Saline when I used Warp Ragnarok on the boss. Something good to know about this game is that all luck in this game is seeded, so if you know you're going to miss like this, you'll have the same result as long as you don't change your seed by moving another unit. But even then, we just barely made it out of the 50-50 with 7 turns. Chapter 5, Retaking the Castle. I originally thought this was going to be one of the harder chapters in the game, partly because there's a lot of enemies, and partly because those enemies are stronger than my units. Since these enemies are so strong, I decided to give Sigurd to Louis since the only magic users are in this room with the boss, and they won't activate until the room has an entrance. Now, I tried to complete this chapter for hours, and I was just not getting enough luck in completing it. That is until I decided to take a gander at the left side of the map, which included the most obvious choke point in the game. So after ripping the most devious override, we can beat this chapter in 38 turns. Chapter 6, The Stolen Ring. In this chapter, we get introduced to a unit of the Thief class, Yunaka, and emblem, Micaiah. This emblem is one of the more important ones in the game, specifically because of the skill Augment, but I'll get more into that later once we actually need to use that skill. This chapter went by quickly. I utilized this choke point at the top of the map and fed XP to Alir. 25 turns. Paralog, Mysterious Merchant. This chapter is a paralog, which means it's an optional side story where we can gain more XP and upgrades. In this case, we unlock Anna, which is hiding in this chest. This chapter doesn't really have anything important to add though, so it was a very simple XP grinder. 13 turns. Chapter 7, Dark Emblem. This chapter may seem insignificant, but trust me, we will be revisiting this chapter at some point in the future to talk about a new feature the boss of this chapter, Hortensia, has. We once thought that only Lumera would be able to use emblem powers, but in this case, Hortensia is able to use the emblem powers without ever engaging via Dark Sync. Keep this in mind because this will be important for later, but for now, we can pretty much solo Alir our way through this chapter with our extremely high avoid stat. 33 turns. Paralog, Budding Talent. I'm not going to talk too much about this Paralog, but I used it to level up my non-Alir units since this chapter had lower leveled units. We won the chapter in 26 turns, but I discovered there's a bad ending if you don't save the villagers in time. It's kinda sad, but it's not my fault their village looked like just enough XP. Chapter 8, The Kingdom of Might. After killing off a village, we finally reach Brodia, where we meet Prince Diamant and Emblem Roy. Our goal for this chapter is to defeat the boss, Ivy, and try not to let the enemies seize the castle. I was feeling very confident though. So confident, in fact, that I paired Alir up with Sigurd so we could run on over to Ivy on turn 2. While I let them have their little staring contest, I tried to get more XP for our units at the top of the map. During enemy phase, Alir almost got taken out by all these enemies, but thankfully we survived with 2 health to spare. For turn 3, I used Warp Ragnarok with Celine to deal some chip damage to Ivy, and then tried to deal the remaining damage with Alir, but unfortunately Leaf's Vantage skill kicked in and let Ivy hit a lucky shot. Thankfully, we can rewind and re-roll our RNG by defeating an enemy with a Diamant. 3 turns. Chapter 9, A Clash of Forces. After just scraping by the previous chapter and stealing Ivy's emblem ring containing Leaf, I decided to go back into battle. But before we can even start the battle, King Morian goes straight in and immediately dies. My strategy for this was to defeat some enemies on our way to Ivy and move on to these emblem energy tiles once we ran out of juice. Unfortunately, Jade sacrifices herself for no reason, but we don't let her death be in vain because we pretty much defeated Ivy right after. 7 turns. Chapter 10, The Fell Dragon Sombron. In this chapter, we enter into the kingdom of Elusia, but before going into this chapter, I had to prepare myself and my units because this chapter is a part of a series, which means it's 2 chapters in a row, and we cannot use the shop or upgrade our units in any way during the second chapter. So I decided to buy a bunch of tonics before we were logged away from getting them again. I should also note that chapter 10 is very difficult, and that's because we'll have to battle against Hortensia, a corrupted version of King Morian, and King Hyacinth. My plan was to go in as fast as possible to defeat Hortensia, and I used Micaiah's Augment skill to warp our units forward and one-round her using Louis with Leaf's quadruple hit, Anna with a 50-50 hand axe throw, Celine with the Warp Ragnarok, and Alir with the finishing hit so she can move on to this healing tile. For turn 2, I moved my units around to form a circle around one space, so Yunaka can warp us again to get closer to Hyacinth and Morian. I know I play extremely reckless, but I was trying to do things quickly so I could use my engage time to the fullest. On turn 4, I let Yunaka open this door so Louis and Alir could regain their engage meters, and on turn 5, Alir was left to solo the entire room. Unfortunately, I made some poor decisions and had to restart the chapter. Luckily, I was able to try out a new strategy where I play Ring Around the Rosie with Hyacinth so I can heal up and slowly build my engage meter and beat the chapter in 57 turns. Chapter 11, Retreat. After completing the previous chapter, we get introduced to the Fell Dragon Sombron, and he makes quite the introduction with stealing all of our emblem rings. This means we are unable to make any sort of meaningful moves because we've been reduced to 0. Now we're forced to run away without our emblems and without being able to attack. Our job was to reach these tiles at the end of the map to complete the chapter, so I utilized the bushes on our way to the end of the map to raise our chances of avoiding the incoming enemies. After making it about halfway through the map, we meet up with Ivy and her retainers Kagetsu and Zelkov, which are now a part of our team. They bring us Emblem Lyn and Emblem Lucina, which can now allow Alir and Ivy to attack during this chapter. I did try my best to save engaged turns, but everyone except Alir did end up dying. Thankfully, we were just barely able to escape the chapter after running out of engaged turns. Chapter 12, The Sentinels. After running away from Elusia, Alir's legs felt a little bit tired, so I decided to reclass her into a Wolf Knight, which was possible because of the preparations I did before we started Chapter 10. In this chapter, we arrive at the Queendom of Solm and meet Fogato and his retainers, Bune and Pandreo. Our goal is to rout the enemy, and with our limited emblem ring count of 2, that's going to prove to be quite difficult. And when I mean difficult, I mean the moment we run out of our engaged meter, we will be swarmed by every enemy in the map. To combat this, I tried my best to keep as little enemies in range of Alir as possible, so we can refill our engage meter whenever possible. There were emblem energy tiles in this map, but something to note about this challenge is that it is definitely possible to soft lock yourself in certain situations if your avoid is too high. This means that in certain cases, enemies will refuse to attack you, but that's not much of a problem if you're able to refill your engage meter. This introduces us to something I'd like to call the avoid rate sweet spot, which is much easier to reach than you think. During this playthrough, I tried to keep my avoid rate as high as I could so enemies would have a hard time hitting me. This also means that I couldn't have the hit rate too low so I'd actually be able to get attacked by the enemies. You can see this working very well in this chapter, but obviously the enemies with better hit rate had better chances of hitting us, and chain attacks were always at an 80% minimum. After almost an hour of playing tag with these enemies, we eventually got into a 1v1 situation where none of us were able to attack. So I'm very thankful I thought ahead and let this one engage tile help me out with this final enemy. 45 turns. Chapter 13, Heroes of the Oasis. In this chapter, we meet up with Tamara and her retainers, Marin and Panette. We also get Emblem Ike, which means we can now use 3 units at a time. My strategy for this chapter was interesting. I started by giving Kagetsu the Lin Ring and slowly pushed towards the midpoint of the map. Something good to know about Kagetsu, however, is that his growth rates are one of the best ones in the game. So at this point, I already have him locked in for good, and he definitely shows his worth in this chapter by hitting crit after crit semi-consistently. Even with the terrible situation we ended up being in, Tamara and Kagetsu were able to defeat a lot of the enemies that were bothering us while we camped in the bushes. It was nice having a break from Alir since we definitely needed more units to invest in, but of course Alir was eventually left alone. This caused us to have to wait in the bushes, slowly building our engage meter, using vulnerary after vulnerary. Keep in mind it takes 7 turns to build up our engage meter, because this archer is the only one who could attack us. After 95 very long turns, we can complete the chapter with a very lucky critical hit. Chapter 14, The Battle for Psall. This chapter not only has a really cool name, but it's also one of the most fun maps to play, even though the difficulty might be very high with us only having access to 3 units. Before we started the battle, I gave Panette Emblem Ike, and I gave her a Killer Axe +4 so she'll be able to do lethal damage easily. I also decided to go to our first emblem Paralog, titled the Exalt. These Paralogs allow our units to grow their bond with emblems higher than the normal level 10. This can allow us to get 1 extra turn while engaged, as well as shorten our engage meter by 1. The Lucina Paralog wasn't too difficult, but it was very RNG dependent since I let Kagetsu and Panette do all the work, since we were unable to use Lucina while in her Paralog. I did try the Ike Paralog, but it was definitely not possible at this moment because of his absurd amount of defense. So now for our first attempt on the battle for Psall, we don't get very far. And the second attempt is pretty much the same thing. For the third attempt though, I decided to try out a different method, which I thought was kind of funny. I would go to the right side with my units as normal, but instead of moving in on the enemy bosses in the middle, which include Marnie, Mauvier, Zephyr, and Hortensia, I would go to this room with 2 chests where we can easily block this door with 2 of our units and funnel in enemies to gain back our engage meter and slowly damage the bosses with Lin's Astra Storm. This worked exceptionally well, and combining this strat with single boss activation, we were able to lure every boss in one by one to pick them off with ease. 34 turns were needed for this chapter, and we unlocked Emblem Byleth as a reward. Chapter 15, Dancer in the Ruins. This is a very condensed map with lots of tight spaces. Our goal to complete this chapter is to bring Seedal of the Dancer class to the end of the map. The Dancer class is very special since if a unit is on an adjacent space, the Dancer can give their turn to that unit and allow them to move again. This move is extremely helpful to us because we obviously have limited movement, but this can help make that movement slightly less limited. It does give us XP though, so we will have to be engaged in order to use it. The first turns are of Alir and Co, trying their best to reach Seedal before he takes too much damage. After saving him, we can move to the next room on the map where we get introduced to Miasma tiles. These tiles are filled with a vile aroma that will lower our team's defense and resistance by 20 and grow the enemy's defense and resistance by 20. This isn't good for us to get caught up in, so it's for the best that we stay away from these tiles. or we can utilize Emblem Corrin, which Seedal spawns in with, and remove the tiles by using Dragon Vein. Dragon Vein does not give us any XP either, so it's perfectly fine to use while unengaged. The first room was simple enough to get through, but it did use all our team's engage meters, so we did have to use the second room as an engage meter grinder so we can move on without trouble. In the third room, I decided to put Panette out in the front to use Great Aether on these miasma tiles, since you could actually remove the miasma effects using the wind Great Aether creates. And while she was busy tanking hits, I had Pendreo refill his engage meter since I gave him Byleth, which will allow us to give adjacent units another turn by using his skill, Goddess Dance. These combined moves helped us get past the third room without trouble. Now for the fourth and final room. This room has some enemies blocking the exit, and we were about to run out of engage meter turns with our units. Thankfully, we had 2 engaged tiles in room 3 that I was able to collect with Pendreo and Kagetsu. Something nice about room 4 is that none of the enemies seem to attack you unless you were in the room. So I let Seedal use Dragon Vein to create an ice wall, and I let Kagetsu use Lin's skill, called Doubles, to make 4 disposable units. This causes the enemies to start going toward our units and open up the area we need to go in order to beat the chapter. For the final turn of the chapter, I opened the path even further with Kagetsu and put Seedal as close as I could to the door. Then I Goddess Danced with Pendreo and finished the map in 25 turns. Chapter 16, Seashore Travels. I originally thought this chapter was going to be normal since we had a lot of units that we could actually use now, one of those being Rosado since he spawns in with Emblem Erica. But oh, was I so wrong. No matter what I did, I would always get overwhelmed by enemies, and after a while, I decided to give up for a little bit and check out the Lin Paralog. This Paralog was pretty difficult since there was a lot of archers, so our flower units, which now included Kagetsu, weren't very good for this Paralog. I decided it would be best if I let the enemies come to me instead of us coming to them, so for the first few turns I went to damage some archers close to Alir's spawn point, so we wouldn't get overwhelmed for later. After that, we'd go into these bushes and hide while Lin started to make her move towards us. After she made it to us, I let Panette do what she does best and land multiple critical hits on Lin to beat the Paralog. After that, I decided a better way to go about Chapter 16 would be to play as cowardly as possible. So I did just that. I don't have much footage of this chapter since I was playing in handheld mode during this, but for pretty much the entire chapter, I ran circles around the map with Alir and used these towers to regain health every time I needed to. I also gave 11 sword to Alir so she could actually deal damage to Marnie, since magic damage goes through armor. After a few laps around the map, we were able to defeat the chapter with 126 turns. Chapter 17, Serenity and Ruin. After running around the beach, we paid a visit to Firene, where we needed to battle against Zephyia, Gris, Marnie, Mavir, Corrupted Hyacinth, and Vale. I don't think I've mentioned this earlier, but corrupted character units are people who died but are resurrected using Fell Dragon power, so that's why Hyacinth is here after he clearly died. Anyways, I first decided to go after Gris, since he could warp Ragnarok to us with Celica. This was the easiest part. Now we need to go towards the left side to take care of Marnie and Mavir. Marnie was easily defeated using Pendreo, and Mavir wasn't very strong. So all that was left was Zephyia, Hyacinth, and Vale. To prepare for this part, I decided to fill up everyone's engage meter before going up to the group. After reaching the group, I used Torrential Roar with Pendreo to debuff everyone within its range with Draconic Hex. And once they were weakened, I could attack with Panette to defeat the cavalry unit and Zephyia. After that, I decided to move backwards with my remaining units so we can refill our engage meters, but this Vale girl decided that we shouldn't be standing on the tile I was going to have Alir stand on. This kind of ruined things for us, so I decided it was time to run to the opposite side of the map so we can regain our engage meter easier. After putting the enemy in a perfect line, I torrential roared with Pendreo again, and was able to complete the chapter in 53 turns. We also get Emblem Sigurd and Leaf back. Chapter 18, Cold Voyage. Before starting this chapter, I thought it would be nice to try out some Paralogs since we actually had some building up. First off, I tried the Ike Paralog, which we probably played for the 10th time, since we were having a lot of trouble with it before. But for this attempt, we had actual good units on our side, so we were able to shred through Ike's armor with ease and gain max bond level with him. Next up was the Corrin Paralog, and it was completely luck-based. For the last Paralog before the next chapter, I chose Sigurd's The Holy Knight. This Paralog wasn't that difficult, I just had to wait a bunch with Panette and tactically play out my attacks to get rid of as many enemies as possible. This was much easier to do with Somniel by our side, by the way. In the end, I lowered the bridge and prepared to turn my progress back to RNG. We ended up hitting 5 crits in a row. Now for the actual chapter we were going for, I decided to rotate Hortensia into the mix since we desperately needed a healer on our team. This was a huge moment for us, since we were able to make some riskier moves now since Hortensia would be able to fully heal any critically injured unit. With a bit of luck, we were able to defeat Abaim for the second time. 4 turns. Chapter 19, The Dead Town. After sailing across the land and taking one of the enemies for our own team, we head back to Elusia where we find a town completely empty. Unfortunately, we have to battle Marnie and Mavir again to get to our next stop. For turn 1, I brought our units closer to the middle row of the map where we would be able to fight the bosses. I engaged Linden and used him to warp Panette closer to Mavir so she can use Grey Aether on incoming enemies. Since there was a lot of miasma around, I decided to put her right in the middle of a flame cannon shot I made Ivy launch. This helped push back some of the units, allowing us to have more space. For turn 2, I brought Saphir onto the team and let everyone else step behind Panette so she could do the fighting while she still had her engage moves. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 crits in a row were hit by Panette. Turn 3 and 4 were the turns that had Mavir start to make a move on us, and we were able to get past him by getting 4 lucky hits with Kagetsu. After Marnie started to move toward us, we had to start putting Pendreo closer in since you would actually be able to get some decent hits on her. The only problem with this was that Marnie had holdout from Roy, so it was going to take about 6 hits in total ideally. During player phase, we were able to take out 2 health bars from her, and after she used Blazing Lion for the 3rd time, we were able to take out her last health bar in 7 turns. Completing this chapter grants us with both Emblem Roy and Emblem Micaiah. This also lets us unlock the Micaiah Paralog, which is extremely easy. Chapter 20, The Kingless Castle. We are now nearing the finale of the game. With less than 10 chapters left to go, we were getting closer and closer to the finish line. This chapter takes place in Elusia Castle, and our job is to defeat Gris holding the Celica emblem. The first turn is spent trying to find Gris hiding in the darkness, but once we find him, he immediately goes to the top of the map. For the next turns, we'll need to navigate through the darkness to move up to Gris, and honestly, it isn't too difficult as long as we use Corrin's skill, Pair Up. This skill allowed us to stand in place as a Leer and regain our engage meter almost instantly because of the number of enemies swarming her. 52 turns. Before heading to our next chapter, we need to prepare. The next 2 chapters are part of a series, so I decided to do the Celica Paralog and the Byleth Paralog. The Celica Paralog took 2 turns, it's the easiest chapter, and for the Byleth Paralog, it wasn't as easy, but we were able to get through it by using Rewarp. Speaking of Rewarp, these staves are extremely limited to us, and they're very hard to come by. Luckily for us, there just so happens to be a trick where we can duplicate Rewarp staves pretty much infinitely as long as we have a staff user that is about to level up. Anyways, look at this crazy inventory. Chapter 21, The Return. This chapter puts us against Vale once more, and she's also paired up with Marth, so she gets pretty good avoid rate. My plan for this chapter was to rewarp once with Hortensia, dance so she could move again, and then rewarp again to get next to Vale. After dealing some major damage with Panette, Kagetsu, Ivy, and Alir, we can clear this chapter in only 1 turn. Chapter 22, The Fell and the Divine. After completing that chapter, we can finally say we have collected all 12 emblem rings in the game. The only problem with this is that now every single emblem is in one place, and Sombron takes advantage of that and injects Alir with a lethal dose of Dragon Breath. Yup. They killed off the main character and stole all of our progress in order to create Gradlon. During this, Alir finds herself in this odd place, and Vale is here too for some reason, even though she isn't dead. They come to a compromise eventually, and Vale revives Alir Fortnite style, and she becomes a corrupted like most of the other enemies in this game. A little side effect that also happens as a result of this corruption is that we don't sync with emblems the same way we used to. We've lost the ability to summon emblems as a divine dragon and can only summon them via Dark Sync. Now, let's go back to chapter 7 and read what the guide for Dark Sync says. Some foes can also use emblems in combat. These emblems cannot engage, but they can still do engage attacks. That's right, This is the only chapter in the entire game that does not allow us to use engage mode. This might be the end. What can we do? We can't attack, we can't even heal. We can't do anything. However, something I never mentioned during this playthrough is the fact that I've been collecting as many bond fragments as possible. I did this so we can level up our bond with Emblem Corrin and Emblem Celica. And you might be wondering, why specifically these emblems? And my answer for that is the strategy of a sentry I'd like to introduce as Holy Stance Sweep. The idea of the strategy is that 50% of all damage dealt to our units will reverse to the corrupted enemies, and after we wait next to our units, we can heal 20 HP each using Quality Time Plus. The only real hole in this strategy I can see is the fact that Holy Stance only affects the corrupted, but something that only 7 out of the 42 chapters in this game feature are corrupted exclusive maps. And this happens to be one of them. But even with this help, there seems to be another rare feature in this map that allows infinite reinforcements so long as the first objective is still active. This means our job for this chapter is to collect 11 emblem rings and tank more than 3,600 damage. Let's find out if this is possible. Yeah, I was humbled very quickly. This moment made me feel very discouraged about my strategy, and honestly, I thought I might have to end the challenge here. But, in the back of my mind, I knew it had to be possible, some way, somehow. So, for the next 7 days, I took the time to re-strategize my approach, and grind. But not the normal grinding you'd think, since skirmishes were very limited and maddening, and also they were usually extremely difficult. I didn't originally want to use this feature, but I decided if it had to come down to this point, I might as well. Introducing Relay Trials. In Relay Trials, you get to play simple maps with your units, but after a certain number of turns, another player takes over your units and plays the rest of the map until you win. But that's not what we're here for. After you complete a relay trial, you or your teammates may receive 3 to 5 rewards based on your performance. These may include stat enhancers like the Draco Shield or the Speedwing. So yes, I spent hours and hours grinding these relay trials just so I can complete this one chapter. But that's not all. When I tried going back into the chapter again with a different approach, I noticed Alir would always get stuck in between multiple enemies without being able to move. So my only idea to combat this was to reclass her into a thief so she could use the skill Pass, which allows a unit to run through an enemy unit. Her avoid rate went down, but I decided that mobility was going to be more important since she's the only one who can complete the objective. Since we were going to reclass her into a thief though, I had to go all the way back to chapter 20 to get more XP for Alir so she could actually get the Pass skill. Thankfully, these avoid tiles make us completely unhittable because we are a covert unit now, so my plan seems pretty good. But I still thought it wasn't good enough, so I decided to look at all the bond rings that can give us skills, and I found out that the Deirdre S ring gives us a skill called Renewal that grants the user 5 HP every turn. At this point, I thought if this didn't work, nothing would. I was putting out all the stops in order to complete this chapter, so now, let's find out if it's actually possible. The first few turns were aggressive. I tried to get the rings as fast as possible to minimize the amount of reinforcements that would flood in if turn 18 came around. Having Alir pass through all the enemy units proves to be very helpful also, since we can easily pick up the other rings on our way to the bottom of the map. I grabbed the rings with all the units I could, but I left Kagetsu to run away with the Deirdre ring so he could heal himself and others when the time came. This was probably one of the most important parts of this strategy, and if I did end up getting a ring with Kagetsu, he'd lose the bond ring and won't be able to heal himself. At this point, we had Ivy, Kagetsu, and Alir at the bottom of the map, and the rest of the emblems were in view and ready to be collected. On turn 10, we successfully collected every emblem ring in the map. I'm surprised how quick that went by, but I'm definitely grateful since there would be 3 more healers spawning in on turn 11. But now that we've got all the rings, it's time for the part that required the healing the most. With 3 units to our name, we have Kagetsu and Ivy for our damage takers, and Alir for just staying still. For the next turns, all we had to do was stay absolutely still and continuously heal Ivy and Alir with Kagetsu while taking damage. This was pretty boring, I won't lie, but it had to be done. On turn 130, the enemy side was running out of healers, and we were able to successfully take out 2 units. On turn 439, we took out one of the 2 corrupted worms. I think you can guess how long I spent on this chapter. After more than 1,000 turns, we finally got rid of the crowd, and all that was left was this corrupted worm and a mage. These 2 were pretty easy to get rid of. 1,000 plus turns. I don't think anything ahead of us will ever top this number. That was probably the hardest part of this game. After completing the chapter, Alir starts to fade away from taking so much damage. She once again dies, but this time the emblems use a power they've never used before, and after dying the second time, she gets resurrected once more into Emblem Alir. Now our new goal in order to finish the game is to take out a few crystals that are in the next few maps, and after we've done that, we can finally battle Sombron. Chapter 23, The 4 Hounds. After dying twice in one chapter, we can finally continue on with the story. This chapter wasn't actually too difficult, we had enough Avoid on Alir to dodge most of the attacks. The only thing we really needed to worry about was the corrupted worms, since their skill Spirit Strike would remove 5 points off of our engage meter. All I really did here was stay in one place farming engage points. 14 turns. Chapter 24, Recollections. In this chapter, we receive a magic item from Zephia that'll help us with getting the second crystal by going back in time to defeat past Alir. This was one of my least favorite maps in the game, so I wanted to get this done quickly. The first turn was spent bringing Alir to the middle of the map, and Penet, Pendreo, and Kagetsu to this top area to grab the Yukon Vasera axe, which we actually have no use for since Penet can only carry up to A rank axes. During the second turn, I got closer to Past Alir and put myself in a terrible situation where Past Alir could end us right away, but she just decided not to for some reason. 3 turns. Chapter 25, The Final Guardian. We were now onto the final crystal we needed to break in order to have a chance at defeating Sombron, but the last thing standing in our way was Lumera. Corrupted Lumera. I thought this was going to be really difficult for us, but we were actually able to rewarp with Hortensia and get to Lumera, pick up the Syncetia, and beat the chapter in only 4 turns. After this chapter, I decided, hey, why not 100% the game? So I went to the Erica Paralog and completed it in 2 turns. It was extremely easy after we were leveled up. I also tried the Leaf Paralog and the Marth Paralog, which were made very easy using the rewarp staff. Now for the Connector. This is the final Paralog before the finale, and it's also another map that's corrupted exclusive. We aren't going for a Holy Stance sweep a second time though, so we were able to quickly run through this in 14 turns. We have completed every chapter in this game so far. We've gone through so many challenges, but ultimately, it has brought us to this final moment. Chapter 26, The Final Engage. After completing everything in the game, we find ourselves at our final stop, Sombron. Phase 1 was no trouble, he was basically powerless in his pre-transformation state. But after defeating him using Zelkov, we can move on to the second phase of the battle, where he brings out some mini-bosses for us to defeat in order to break his Fell barrier, which negates all damage done by our units. Turn 1 had us bring Pendreo to the top left using Hortensia to rewarp. After that, I would move to the bottom left with Penet for this other enemy, run to the top right with Alir, and go to the bottom right with Kagetsu, Mavir, and Ivy. My strategy here was to defeat these boss enemies as fast as possible, so we would be able to deal enough damage to Sombron before he uses his attack called Disengage. This attack does exactly what you'd think. It disengages all currently engaged units, and in addition to that, if you're attacked by Sombron, he will use a hidden ability that brings the unit's engage meter down by 1. So he really doesn't want us to be engaged with our emblems. On turn 2, I defeated all the mini-bosses except for the one nearest to Alir, and I did this specifically because if I kept one alive, but also had them attack me on enemy phase, we would have an entire turn to attack Sombron before he brings in more mini-bosses to repair his Fell barrier. On the bottom half of the map, I made sure to protect Seedal and Veil since they could dance for our units and give them an extra turn. Since extra turns are going to be very important, I decided to use Grey Aether with Penet so we can get some chip damage in on Sombron immediately after the turn would start. During enemy phase, we were able able to defeat the enemies on the top right and protect Vale and Seedal. We also took off a chunk of health from Sombron using Grey Aether. My first decision for this turn was to use Alir to poison Sombron with our dagger. After that, I used Warp Ragnarok with Ivy and the Parthia with Kagetsu to remove Sombron's first health bar. For the next health bar, I decided to go for my heaviest hitter, Panette, and she got a 66 damage critical hit off Sombron. At this point, I think you can see the circle I've created with my units. I made a circle so I could dance with Seedal to let Kagetsu take care of Sombron's second health bar, and use Goddess Dance with Vale to not only gain back every adjacent ally's turn, but since Byleth is engaged with a dragon, we also get to boost all stats to everyone who is included in the dance. Now that we have 5 more moves, I decided to move Alir next to Panette and double up on Poison. This not only raises damage dealt to Sombron, but it also raises damage to Panette because of Alir's personal skill, Divinely Inspiring. We were able to get Sombron to his last health bar by getting a critical hit with Panette, and now, with 1 health bar left, it was looking pretty good for us. So I decided to attack with Ivy, and we got a lucky 10% critical hit. Volcanon does even more. Come on, here we go, here we go. No way, no way, no way. Ivy got the crit. Ivy got the crit. We just completed Fire Emblem Engage while only using Engage mode. This challenge was definitely the most difficult challenge I have ever done, and it has taken me more than 200 hours of gameplay in total to complete it. It's kind of weird to see though, since most of the units in the credits have no stats at all. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed watching this video I spent so much time on, and I will do the fail Xenologue if enough of you want to see it. Anyways, that's all I got.